Today we're talking about Risk of Rain Returns to answer the question, is it a remake or a demaster? Now, for full disclosure, I love Risk of Rain 2 and had a ton of fun with the expansion, but I never played the original Risk of Rain 1. Though, as part of researching for this video, I did look at a lot of other people's reviews and their thoughts on the game. Now, Risk of Rain 2 is a 3D roguelike game that's very action-oriented and quite fast-paced. There's even some references to Path of Exile. Risk of Rain 1 is a 2D platformer roguelike, which some people described as being more similar to a Metroidvania game. So after playing Risk of Rain 2 for quite a long time, and now spending a good few hours getting familiar with Risk of Rain Returns, I have to say I do prefer the faster pace of Risk of Rain 2, and the fact that movement feels much better in that game. But I can also see the charm of Risk of Rain 1, and I think there's a lot of interesting things to talk about here. And if you like seeing my thoughts on a wide variety of games, or maybe you like the series' worst ARPG ever, then do be sure to get subscribed as another episode of that is coming out soon. So first up, the classes are exactly what you would expect. First Commando, he feels about the same. He's pretty boring, but reasonably effective. Bandit feels very different from Risk of Rain 2, and honestly, much, much worse. Then you have Huntress, who is always, of course, the best character because attacking while moving is awesome, and it's even more awesome in Risk of Rain Returns. I can't stress enough how important it is to be able to deal damage while moving. Then another class I spent a bit of time playing was the Enforcer, a tank-type class, who's short range and relatively slow as he doesn't have a movement skill, but he does have the ability to block, which can get you into some cheesy situations, and can also get you killed when your cheese isn't quite cheesy enough. And of course, the monsters are also overall what you would expect. There's a mix of melee and ranged enemies, but interestingly, different monsters deal with terrain in different ways. Some enemies, like jellyfish, just kind of fly around and don't care because they get to move in 3D space and no, I'm not jealous, you're jealous. Other enemies, typically humanoids like Lemurians, can do things like climb up ropes and ladders, potentially even jump across gaps, and in general, act a lot like a player. Then you have things such as wisps and crabs that just kind of go back and forth wherever they spawn. They can't really traverse very much and as a result aren't a serious threat. You can simply walk a stage away and laugh at them. But what would a Risk of Rain game be without items? And items are by far the best part in Risk of Rain Returns. It's so fun to get a uke, Tesla coil, or anything else that the game has, because there's a lot of items which I personally didn't recognize, like meat nuggets. I mean, everyone loves eating monster meat nuggets, and why not use a rusty knife while you're at it? I guess rusty knife is similar to tri-tip dagger, but overall, it's really nice to see a wide variety of items, and it feels like there's more items in Risk of Rain Returns than there was in Risk of Rain 2. Though not all of the items serve the same purpose. For example, gasoline in Risk of Rain 2 causes all nearby enemies to become ignited when you kill an enemy, whereas gasoline in Risk of Rain Returns puts a burning patch on the ground that does do a significant amount of damage, though I don't know if the damage stacked because I only ended up getting gasoline once so far and didn't have that much time to play with it. Like in any other Risk of Rain game, you drop down to the planet and you start off by exploring. There are a lot of things to buy, chests, drones, the usual stuff you'd expect, but there aren't too many enemies in the beginning. On the one hand, this does give you a good amount of time to scope stuff out. On the other, I feel like there's a bit too long where there aren't enemies, and I tend to get a little bit bored. Though this ramps up with time, so it's not too bad on the later stages. Some of the earlier ones definitely feels a little bit too barren. Though I suppose that is time that you can use to find the teleporter and plan out how you're going to deal with the level. There's ropes and ladders for you to climb. Of course, little holes in the terrain that are annoyingly difficult to see to fall down, and yes, you do take fall damage. Plus the usual things to help you jump up and get to a higher elevation. There's even secrets hidden around each stage. These secrets can be some rare items, or alternatively, just lore. But either way, it's pretty darn fun to go collect them. As time progresses, difficulty increases. More enemies spawn, and more dangerous types of enemies spawn. Which leads to a very hectic boss battle, and yes, you can have challenges of the mountain, which means you'll be fighting not just one boss, but multiple bosses. Again, everything that you would expect from Risk of Rain is here, and overall, that's pretty good. And if you manage to defeat the boss, you'll get to go on to the next stage and do it again. I would assume that, like Risk of Rain 2, there's also a boss at the end, but I haven't gotten to that stage, at least so far. But that's where things kind of get problematic for me. Because while it is true to Risk of Rain 1, That means it's a brutally difficult, fairly clunky 2D platformer. And when it comes to platformers, maybe it's just because I'm bad at jumping, but I generally like platformers with smooth mobility. Now, don't get me wrong, Risk of Rain 2 can get pretty punishing in the endgame. You have to time your jumps and your dodges correctly, along with using your movement skill if applicable to avoid enemy damage while having the best damage output possible. But because Risk of Rain 2 has a fair bit of aiming, I was kind of expecting that going into Risk of Rain Returns. But right now you can shoot left, and you can shoot right, and you can't change direction if you're already firing. Though the developer has addressed this, and they said they are going to be changing that part. Because right now it's really awkward if an enemy is on a slightly different elevation than you. You either have to go up and fight them on their level, or jump and play this awkward game of will they, won't they, and sometimes you just can't hit stuff. So right now, aiming does feel like a downside. But on the other hand, for a 2D pixel art game, the levels are surprisingly expansive. So much so that the camera seems to be zoomed out far further than I would expect from a game like this, and yet I don't often feel like I'm running up against the edges of a map. In part, this is because it can be a little bit difficult to traverse everything when playing on the time limit. But the time limit is part of Risk of Rain gameplay, and honestly, it's what makes things super exciting. But something else that's been brought from Risk of Rain into Risk of Rain Returns is brutally unforgiving difficulty. On a lot of my runs, especially with Commander and Bandit, I couldn't even get past the boss of a first stage reliably, and I have yet to beat the third stage despite playing for several hours. Now, I'll admit, it took me a good few hours when I played Risk of Rain 2 to get to the moon and confront the game's final boss. I won't go into more detail because I don't want to spoil anything. But in Risk of Rain 2, I felt like I was making progression by getting a better build or improving my character in some other way. Sometimes it was just using my abilities better, learning how to aim, all that stuff. Whereas in Risk of Rain Returns, I didn't feel like I was making progress, to a point where I ended up setting enemy damage to 75% of what it is normally. And after that, the game actually became a lot more enjoyable. And if I hadn't found it, I probably would have had a significantly lower opinion of the game, because I felt like a lot of the characters just weren't really viable at full damage. Which is mostly because I find myself constantly struggling to DPS things down. I get stuck when I'm firing in the wrong direction. Overall, I like a lot of the ideas here. And I think with some tweaks, it could be really awesome, but it's not quite there yet. Number one, you need to be able to fire and move in different directions. Your firing, or your weapon, should follow your mouse, unless you're doing something like playing the Enforcer, where when he's using his shield he gets to block, but he's locked into only facing in one direction. That's perfectly reasonable, and I totally understand it. This would also mean that I could play characters that aren't the Huntress, because the Huntress gets to do damage while moving, just making her the best character by far. Now, additionally, something else that I think is a little clunky right now is the jumping. It doesn't quite require pixel-perfect actions, but it's pretty close. And so I think that could use a little bit of improvement as well, where you don't quite have as many annoying falls. Now, when things aren't too hectic, there's only a few enemies on screen, the game does a pretty good job. When things get more hectic, I often lose track of a player character, probably due to the zoom out. So I think either the game should zoom in just a little bit for boss fights, or maybe have a few less enemies on the screen, or maybe just add a better player highlight so you can more easily see yourself. Overall though, I don't think these are major problems if you're a fan of Risk of Rain 1, because from everything I've heard, it does a brilliantly faithful job of keeping to that game's mechanics. And maybe all of my requests are going to make the game too much like Risk of Rain 2, and not what the fans wanted, since the game is so far very positively received. Plus, there's one whole aspect that I just didn't cover so far. That is multiplayer, because yes, the best part of Risk of Rain, be it 1, 2, or the remaster, is being able to play with your friends. And so far, I had just been playing by myself because I wanted to get some raw first impressions of the game. But I think this will be a lot more fun when I'm playing with friends, especially since I can play the Hunters and leave them playing all the other characters. Now, another big difference between Risk of Rain Returns and Risk of Rain 2, at least from my experience so far, is you get a lot more of the rarer items in Risk of Rain Returns, which is really fun, because like I said before, items are the most fun part of Risk of Rain, and this has been my experience pretty much from the start, so it's really awesome to get a rare item and then be able to base your run off of it. I haven't quite gotten Shatter Spleen yet, but I did have a run with a Tesla Coil, and oh my god, that was just so fun. Walking by enemies to zap them is great. Grab a couple of ukes, maybe an Explodey effect or gasoline, which by the way drops flames on the ground, rather than causing nearby enemies to just magically catch fire. And oh boy, you're in for a good time. Because yes, it is still a Risk of Rain game, and you're still going to want to stack Explodey effects. So the overall verdict for me is I'm probably only going to play it with friends. But if you really liked Risk of Rain 1, then I suggest you check it out for yourself. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Hopo Games and Gearbox Publishing for providing me with a free key to the game. You can use the link down in the description, and check Risk of Rain Returns out for yourself if you're a big fan of Risk of Rain 1, or if anything I said piqued your interest. I do think with a couple patches it's going to get a lot better, and multiplayer should be a blast as always. But if you did spend a lot of time playing Risk of Rain 1, I'm curious about some of your thoughts down below, since I've never actually played the original. With that said, if you're looking for something else to watch, maybe check out my thoughts on Risk of Rain 2, which, as I said, I had a ton of fun with. I've played it for well over 100 hours, between both solo and multiplayer, and there's just something about that game that even when I'm losing, I'm having a ton of fun because the build and items are just so awesome. Links to those videos will be up in the card and down below, along with a link to my Nexus where you can purchase Risk of Rain 2 and help to support the channel. With that said, thanks for watching, and a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you don't make videos just like this one possible. And if you'd like to see some more Risk of Rain 2 content or other roguelikes, be sure to suggest a game down below, or just let me know that you want to see Risk of Rain 2 gameplay. But that's all for me today. I would say that Risk of Rain Returns is absolutely a faithful remaster, and even manages to add some really nice cool items, but as a solo experience, it's not for me, so when I play it, I'm going to stick to a multiplayer. With that said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again sometime soon.